Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's guest is Andrew Cockburn. He is the editor of Harpers Magazine. He is an author, article writer, and documentary film producer as well. Quite an esteemed career and all of that. He is here today to talk about the influence of the arms industry in society, government, politics, the military, and of course, obviously, foreign policy now and before. Appreciate you coming on today, Andrew. How are you doing?
Very happy to be with you. I should correct one thing. I'm the Washington editor of Harpers Magazine.
Yeah, sure.
Lofty title, but not quite supreme power.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. So obviously the topic of discussion today is the influence of the arms industry. Obviously, you wrote a book about that. I can put that on the screen and the show notes as well. And there's lots of different avenues to go down when talking about the arms industry. So before we get to the obvious kind of foreign policy side of things up until today with Ukraine, Taiwan, how much kind of influence do you think the arms industry just has in kind of general society through media, think tanks, films, or anywhere else do you think it kind of gets into to society?
Well, it's vast. I mean, it really permeates every corner. I should say, in some ways, it's not immediately evident because you don't see uniforms on the streets, even in Washington, even around the Pentagon. People don't tend to wear their uniforms off duty. Around the Pentagon, you can see the thing to look for are sort of young, fit-looking people, men and women, men with short haircuts, jogging. That's that's one evident sign. But otherwise, it's vast. I mean, you starting. For example, just a little thing on the Washington Metro, the our tube system. You'll see ads for weapon systems, which the ordinary customer, ordinary traveler wouldn't necessarily be able to go out and buy a $100 million fighter, but that's aimed at decision makers, at congressmen, at lobbyists, and so forth. Another extreme example: all the military services maintain offices in Hollywood to facilitate the movie industry in anything they want to make with the military theme. And you submit your script and you say, I'd like to borrow an aircraft carrier or a fighter jet or tank or something like that, have a scene in my movie, and they have to approve the script, which, so surprise, surprise, a lot of movies tend to have views not unfavorable to the military point of view. I mean, and then around the country, you have, hundreds of bases. Again, they tend to be sort of away from major population centers, but there's a couple of huge bases actually in the Washington area, Fort McNair and Fort Myer, which you drive past and, people don't, it's sort of part of the landscape. You see, then you look a bit, the other obviously huge influence, if you look for it, is the vast budget, which is over half of all the discretionary spending in this country. Hundreds of, this year, I think they're going for, according to different sort of ways of measurement, it's close around $850 billion, which is like quite an extraordinary amount. So in every way, shape, and form, the military, the military influence is pervasive in this country. And tonight, as we speak, the president will be addressing Congress, and in the front row will be the members of the Supreme Court and the chiefs of all the military services in uniform, I should say. So, they are, so I don't know, I could go on for some time on just that issue, but yes, they're all around us.
Yeah, sure. And obviously the arms industry and the military go hand in hand where, at baseball games and sporting events in both the UK and the US, you'll have maybe something to do with the army at halftime. Again, just kind of that drumming up that kind of patriotism towards the
Absolutely.
military, no matter what it does. How do you kind of compare it with other countries, more, I guess, specifically the UK, as obviously the UK, beyond, after the US is normally one of the top arms dealers around the world with, France, Russia, and the others. How do you kind of see it in the UK? Do you think it's a similar operation, but maybe a bit
Well,
more subtle, or obviously there's less money involved?
well, right. I mean, comparatively speaking, tiny. But what's the UK Army is what, 80,000 men and women now. I mean, it's it's a sort of, I regard as a sort of the poor cousin, but in every other way, it sort of mimics the US, and it's quite significant that one of the major US defense contractors, BAE Systems, is a British company, although they have a huge presence here. One of the prime contractors. It's one of the things that really underpins the relationship between the US and Britain. And, no way, no how is Britain ever going to deviate much from American policy for all sorts of reasons, one of which is certainly the huge dependency of a big chunk of British industry on American orders.
Yeah, and of course, within this conversation, it's obviously worth saying there's lots of different influences outside of obviously the arms industry that goes into decisions with, politicians, government, wars, and foreign policy. It's obviously part of that, and in some situations seems to be, maybe at the forefront, but it's obviously not always some, MP or senator being paid off by the arms trade. There can be lots of other factors. So how does kind of, speaking on, I guess, on the financial side of things, when it comes to things like lobbying, how is that kind of system in place, that the arms trade do kind of give this much money to kind of senators and other kind of political figures?
Well, they're huge donors. Lockheed, the big primes, Lockheed, Raytheon, BAE Systems, Northrop, General Dynamics. I mean, they're huge contributors to to members of Congress, to senators and congressmen. And you can see this reflected in contracts. It's called political engineering. When there's a big contract for, say, the F-35 fighter, you'll notice that the major contracts are all in districts, or go to districts of people supportive of the arms industry. So, as if you're a congressman or a senator, you better believe that if you don't vote the right way for a big appropriation for a Lockheed fighter or whatever it might be, your district won't be getting, or is less likely to get the contracts for for whatever that, subcontracts for one of those systems. Conversely, once you become a powerful member of Congress in one of the relevant committees, like, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, suddenly your district, even if it never had a single arms factory there before, will suddenly sprout, factories, plants, offices by the dozen. That's is a payoff, and it means it ensures your loyalty to the relevant contractor, the relevant service, the relevant, to the defense budget.
Yeah, don't people obviously also talk about when they do kind of set up obviously these arms factories in different districts and states, like probably what maybe you implied there, it means that obviously jobs are created from that. So when decisions are made, on military decisions, then the senators and congressmen then have to think about, oh, we're actually going to lose jobs here, and it's kind of that as
Yeah,
almost
sure.
entrapment.
For sure, it's always couched as jobs. I mean, they prefer to talk about the jobs that'll be generated in their district as opposed to the money that their campaign chests will get. That's obviously part of it. Yeah, actually, I should say that although there is a huge number of people employed and it's a huge chunk of the U.S. manufacturing industry, its various studies have shown that actually, compared to other ways you can spend money, it generates fewer jobs. I mean, there's been studies done to show that, if you spent the money on education or on health or on perhaps more benign occupations, that would actually generate more jobs. But the power of the military-industrial complex ensures that the money goes to them and not to these other avenues.
And obviously, that term used there, the military-industrial complex, comes from President Eisenhower in his speech, obviously going way back to the 1950s, 1960s, where he's talking about, America before didn't have this many, defense companies, they call them defense companies, these arms companies, and obviously the kind of merging between that and the actual, obviously, civilian side of the military.
Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals.
Do you think the arms industry, before we get onto kind of, Ukraine, war on terror, wherever you kind of want to go, do you think the arms industry and other kind of financial interests, as I was kind of talking to Kelly Vlahos about this last week, that the US empire isn't always run to create the most successful empire can be pushed forward by these special interests. Do you think the arms industries actually push them towards maybe conflicts like Ukraine that actually do harm if you're trying to create, an empire that lasts? Do you think the arms industry is actually almost a negative force on imperial ambitions, kind of what we've seen over the last 20 years or so?
Well, I would argue that the object of the exercise is not the empire. The object of the exercise is the arms industry. It's the arms industry that pushes these imperial ambitions for the benefit of the arms industry. I would think I think to say that industry exists to support the empire has got it the wrong way around. The empire exists to support the arms industry. I mean, there was a friend of mine who was a long time inmate of the Pentagon. He said that the American government has two functions: to buy arms at home and sell arms abroad, and that's really what it does. So that's why, when they have these, useless, pointless wars like 20 years in Afghanistan or the whole Iraq adventure and many others. In terms of the arms industry, they're commonly perceived and written up as disasters, but from the arms industry, and the the military-industrial complex, that's the arms industry and the services, they're quite successful. I mean, I've forgotten what the latest figure for Afghanistan was, but it was well over $1 trillion. So that's all very good. So I don't, I think we have to look at it in that light, rather than, just saying that it's, the effect of the arms industry on the empire. The effect of the empire on the arms industry is wholly beneficial, as far as I can see.
Do you think with the war on terror, you obviously mentioned Afghanistan and Iraq there, do you think the arms industry actually had much influence on the decision to go there? Because there was obviously so many factors, or do you think it was more the arms industry actually kept the war going? Obviously, no one ever wants to be the president who lost the war as well, but do you think the arms industry was more, not that was the sole figure that pushed it to actually happen, but more the continuation of these 20-year occupations, as you kind of see, during Obama's surge, defense, the arms industry lobbying for things like that to happen. Do you think it actually was a big impact on the wars actually happening, or just continuing as long as they did?
Well, continuing, yes. Actually happening, I would say yes, really. I mean, with Afghanistan, it's slightly complicated because you had, 9/11, and Bush was under enormous political pressure to do something, to have a military response, to lash out in some way. But once they were there, definitely the military machine, which includes, the defense contractors and the services, pushed to have it continue. I know you mentioned Obama. It's a very clear example. Obama was, keen to, when he got in, he was kind of pledged to wind that war down. And they basically said, you can have three options. You can have, a little war, a bigger war, or a much bigger war. And they flipped him, to have a bigger war. And, with the Obama surge into Afghanistan. I mean, I always remember an account that was given to me by a military officer who was present at a meeting when Trump had a sort of his own mini surge in Afghanistan in 2018. It was a meeting of the high command of the one of the services. Actually, it was the Marines. I didn't think I could say that. And there was a bunch of Marine generals sitting around talking about this surge. And they were agreeing that it was completely pointless in terms of winning the war, wasn't going to make any difference. But they said it will do us good at budget time. And that was the point. They were going to get more money, and that was sort of help them get more money. And that was justification enough for them. I mean, they completely sort of disregarded the sort of military aspects of it. They say, oh yeah, the other phrase was, it'll help get our men blooded, which was true too, but they didn't sort of care that much about that. Well, they regarded that as a positive.
Yeah, again, there's always that budget side of things. I remember, again, a similar, I think it was like a New York Times, Washington Post article kind of around the time of the Gulf War. And again, there's so many different factors that went into it. But again, kind of mentioned where, obviously Saddam Hussein through the whole Iran-Iraq war did things like dropped chemical weapons on the Kurds and the Iranians, and they kept backing them, for lots of different reasons. And then, it obviously got all the way up to where he invades Kuwait. But, shortly before that, there wasn't really many signs he was that out of favor with the US. And when the Gulf War did kind of come around again, that talk of budgets and obviously the massive army that they put forward, there is always that aspect of, like you said there, and those smaller kind of conflicts that doing something like this for the budget, just to continue this amount of money going in, like now, as you mentioned, the 850 billion or so budget for the military, not including obviously the like 300 billion fund for the Veterans Authority, the VA, which would put the total over $1 trillion.
You can push the total national security bill to about $1.5 trillion if you include everything, including the VA, the intelligence services, the interest on the debt that you're having to pay, the extra money you have to borrow to pay for all this. So it's about running at about 1.5 trillion now.
So what pushed you to write a book about this subject specifically? Because obviously you can talk about, you know, the military industrial complex, the war on terror, all different things. How come you decided to focus on the arms industry, which obviously has influence on those same things I just mentioned? What was kind of led to you to write the book about the arms industry?
Well, you know, my book was really, or my books have really been about not just the arms industry, but the whole, you know, military industrial complex and the whole way. I'm trying to explain to people how it works. I mean, the most important thing I always try and get across is it's not about defense. You know, it's about money. And so as opposed to like trying to figure out the most effective kind of defense, you know, national defense you could have, and what works and what doesn't, and you know what you can afford. It's the other way around. The whole object of the exercise is to generate the money flow. That's the strategy, is to maximize the money flow by any means possible. And if that means promoting a war, well, so be it. In a way, you know, I think they're not so keen on wars, because they, in the end, they tend to, after the initial sort of patriotic burst, they tend to come in for a lot of bad publicity, which is what happened with Iraq and Afghanistan. In fact, I should clarify something about Iraq. As far as I can see, what happened was the military themselves didn't really, when the Bush administration was, you know, announced they want to invade Iraq in 2003, the military, they weren't that keen on the idea. They couldn't really see the point. But there was an exchange, there was a deal there. I mean, which was that Rumsfeld and the Bush people would increase the budget. And that was their price. They said, okay, if we get more money, then we'll sign off on your invasion. Which, as I said, they weren't saying we really want to invade. They've been just, you know, they were just as happy to have the money. And if they had to invade in the process, they didn't think, because as I said, they don't think much about defense and actual fighting that in any kind of clear-headed way. They thought it would be like sort of, you know, minor exercise. They'd go in, knock off Saddam and withdraw. I mean, that was really what they assumed would happen. And of course, what they didn't figure, which they should have, was the people of Iraq wouldn't be too keen on this. I mean, they didn't like Saddam, were happy to see him go, but they were certainly not happy to be suddenly sort of ruled by this alien military presence, and hence you had the real Iraq War.
Yeah, it definitely seemed for the 2003 invasion of Iraq, it was that group of neocons really at the forefront pushing it, rather than kind of, like you said, the military going, yeah, you know, it's been a while, maybe we should get ourselves into a war or whatever it may be. It was that group of neocons. Right. Really pushing it. Coming up to, I guess, more recent times, how much do you think the arms trade has influenced this kind of new Cold War with Russia and China? And again, there's so much to go into it, just the general hatred towards Russia, wanting to keep them down, stopping China from overtaking them. But you can't help but look at kind of the Ukraine conflict after, you know, the couple years. And there was obviously a lot of rhetoric about wanting to crush Russia, but just a huge presence of how much, you know, people see 100 billion being donated to Ukraine, but what it is the US donating that to the arms trade in America, which they send the weapons. As we've heard Secretary Blinken and Victoria Nuland both say that, you know, most of this money is actually recycled back into our own economy because it's going to American companies. So, and, you know, obviously you see the meetings, massive meetings between CEOs of the arms industry and Zelensky, and, you know, it's hard not to see it. So what do you make of kind of the Ukraine war first, there with the influence of the arms trade on this?
Right. Well, you have to go back a bit to the, you know, really to the 90s and the end of the last Cold War, which, you know, was definitely not good news for the military industrial complex. I mean, you know, they've been built up this huge presence, for 40 years, on the fact, on the premise that you had to confront Soviet Union, and suddenly there was no more Soviet Union. So, what do we need this huge military for? And there was all sorts of talk about the peace dividend, and the military. I say the military, which includes the defense contractors. They started work almost right away to gin up some kind of new confrontation. I mean, they weren't necessarily thinking of a hot confrontation with people actually killing each other, but a threat, to generate a threat which could then be justify further enormous expenditures. And they talked about, they started, for a while they were a bit bereft, so they talked about sort of near peer competitors, people who weren't. I mean, for a while, I remember the Indian Navy in the early 90s. You heard a lot of talk about the threat of the Indian Navy, but after a bit, but the major push was certainly by the mid 90s was NATO expansion. I mean, it was gestating before then, but there was a huge push by the military industrial complex to expand NATO. And I wrote about this a while back. Principal in this effort was the Lockheed Corporation, Lockheed Martin. Among other things, they set up something called the Committee to Expand NATO, which was headed by a vice president of Lockheed. And the whole idea was, it was all part, but the big objective was to sell, on Lockheed's part, was to sell F-16 fighters to the countries of Eastern Europe. And to do that, they had to be in NATO. And that, really, the ultimate prize, that took on a life of its own, with the aid of the neocons you mentioned. And the ultimate prize was to get Ukraine. And, we could go on about that, but I mean, the steady push to involve Ukraine, to peel Ukraine away from the Russian orbit, and make Ukraine ultimately a member of NATO, that was unremitting, which is what really, in my view, I don't see how you could possibly argue that wasn't what generated the Ukraine war. Whatever you think of Vladimir Putin, I mean, it's ridiculous to suppose he has the idea that to recreate the Soviet Union and to invade Western Europe and take Paris and Russian troops on the the Channel coast. That's all nonsense. But what what obviously he was never, or no Russian leader was ever going to accept, was having Ukraine suddenly be part of this enemy alliance. I mean, Yeltsin before Putin used to complain about that very, very vociferously. And American, there's a famous cable from William Burns, who is now the head of the CIA, but I think it was 2008, when he was ambassador, it was in Moscow, he sent a cable saying, Ukraine is a red line from the Russians. They will never accept Ukraine as part of NATO. And that was, patently obvious. So it should have come as no surprise that, given the determination on this side to keep pushing this, that ultimately you had this war.
Yeah, William Burns was the US ambassador to Russia at the time, and the cable's called Niet, means Niet, and it's where William Burns reports back saying Ukraine and Georgia are red lines, Russia will invade. And all around that time you have like the Munich speech Putin did, and then obviously George Bush announcing that Georgia and Ukraine would eventually join NATO, and then obviously the Georgian war, and then again, leading up to now, which shows kind of the events build up that make it pretty obvious that William Burns was right, and he's CIA director right now, and still knows that fact. So obviously a lot of irony there. And just going back to what you said before as well, it seems after the Soviet Union fell and the military and the arms trade are looking for a way to still basically exist as they are, always having to create the new threat to create fear that justifies their existence. So, Soviet Union, and then you have, terrorism, and then as soon as that's fading away, like the Soviet Union, China, seems to fill the new void. And am I correct? One of the characters you mentioned earlier, part of the story, Bruce Jackson, where he was also involved with the committee for expanding NATO while being, I think, was it the strategic advisor or something for Lockheed Martin? It's like a
Vice President for Strategy, yeah.
yeah, and it's like by day he's Lockheed Martin, and by night, he's doing that. Um, Again, there's a lot to say about the Ukraine war. So how do you think it's influencing the new Cold War with China and Taiwan? Obviously, there's lots of arms sales that are going to Taiwan, and again, there's many factors like wanting to stop China rising above the US. But do you think again we see the hand of the arms industry within this policy towards China?
Well, sure. I mean, you have, just give one example. There's, outfit called West Exec Advisors, which are really, they're arms lobby, arms salesmen, really. That's, they advise defense companies how to get contracts, or assist them to get contracts, assist them to sell weapons overseas. And among the founding members are Tony Blinken, who is now Secretary of State, and the other founder was Michelle Flournoy, who was almost made Secretary of Defense by Biden, but she had so many blatant conflicts of interest that she failed in that, but she's still hugely influential. And, if you look, practically every day I get a notice from West Exec saying yet another former senior general or some kind of national security official has joined West Exec. It's, it sort of really underscores this. And if, the military, they talk about China as the pacing threat, meaning, it's a perfect threat to have, because even more perfect in a way than the Russians or the old Soviet Union was because, whereas we used to say that the Soviet Union, well, they're backward, technologically backward, and the Russians, much smaller economy. There's China, giant economy, second biggest or maybe even biggest economy in the world, highly technologically advanced. So that's a real man-sized threat, and therefore all the better for generating, the commensurate effort to, to stand up to it. So it's, they talk, I find that you go to conferences or listen to hearings and so forth, they talk much more, the military and their people, the contractors, talk much more about China than they do about Russia. I mean, but for just those reasons.
Yeah, definitely there is that. They obviously talk about China as the biggest national security threat, which Rishi Sunak, obviously the Prime Minister of the UK, I remember when he was running for his so-called election, he did a whole Twitter thread about how China is the biggest national security threat. When obviously, there's pretty much zero chance they're going to try and invade the US or the UK with zero provocation. It makes no sense. I see it more interesting with China than Russia as well, because it seems like obviously there's so many US and European corporations that have such a big relationship with China that it seems like almost only the arms industry and the military have the motivation to pick this fight, where like Apple and all these other corporations who obviously have massive relationships with China. It's interesting that there is this big push for this, but there definitely seems like there's a split in NATO where they're more on board with the Russia than China threat, because just the economic relationship there is massive, and China is that you're going to be one of the leading countries soon. But I know we're kind of running towards our time here. So is there anything else you want to say about the influence of the arms industry, or anything in your book you think's interesting that maybe a bit more subtle about the kind of the influence of the arms industry?
Well, it's I don't know. It's it's interesting. As I say, I want to reiterate how uninterested they are in defense, really. Like, I mean, for example, let's talk about NATO for a second. Because of Ukraine, they've gotten a big push to get the NATO countries to spend more money. But what are they spending money on? A huge chunk of their budgets are going on the F-35 fighter, Lockheed's F-35 fighter, which, it's a byword here for a sort of a disaster. I mean, it's the ones they built can only fly half, that perform their missions just over, I think it's 51% of the time mission capable, 51% of the time fully mission capable, which means it can do everything it's supposed to be capable of. I think just in the 30s, 33 or 34% of the time. And yet, we've got the British, the Italians, the Swiss, can't remember them all, the Dutch, the Danes, they've all signed on, the Germans, the Norwegians, to buy this useless dog of a plane. Why? Because that's the price the US extracts. Maybe they're so stupid as they don't realize that it doesn't work. But that's where the tithe paid by the European sort of subject nations to the US to be, to have relations with the US. It's a very it's not a subtle point really. It's just, I just find the sort of ongoing disarmament of NATO sort of really curious and interesting in the cause of, which really illustrates my point about it being all about the money. Please, everyone, everyone has to understand that it's the objective of these people is not, to conquer territory, or, they're happy to do that if it'll make them money, but it's to generate the money flow. And that's really what I try and talk about in my books and articles.
Yeah, the Afghanistan War was the best example of that, where it was a failure, from the objective side of it, but from an arms perspective and making money, it was amazing, along with other wars. And again, you just mentioned there, like BAE Systems share price gone right up because all these arms are being sent to Ukraine, that the governments of those countries buy the arms off these companies, send them there, and then they need to buy new ones because they've just ran out. And again, this is going to, happening in China. We see AUKUS, again, another military boondoggle for whoever is involved in selling Australia those submarines. And as you mentioned before, the revolving door, Lloyd Austin used to be a board member of Raytheon, and the same in the UK. Revolving door goes on and on and on. But
I just wanted to add something, which is I've just written an article for Harpers about, which is now you have the tech industry very heavily involved. Microsoft, Google, Amazon. They've really become much more integrated into the military-industrial complex, and you can see one effect of that is the number of retired generals and admirals who now, the moment they retire, they race off to get on the board of some tech startup in California, because that's where the money is. It's just a trend worth noticing.
Yeah, because we obviously saw the tech companies' relationship with the intelligence agencies through Edward Snowden. But as you said, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, all fighting over these cloud military contracts and other stuff. These may be, liberal companies on Silicon Valley, but again, they're just as tied in to the military. But I know you've got to jump off, but I'd like to thank you for your time. I appreciate it. I will put everything in the show notes, the links to your books, to Harpers Magazine and everything else. But thanks again for coming on, and have a lovely rest of the day.
Okay, thank you.